Brian, you can stay, and I'd like to invite John, Colleen, and Caitlin up to the stage for some questions and answers. It is impossible to see the crowd from up here, but I'm hopeful that someone has a question or a challenge. You can go to the microphone, Claire. You're ready. Okay, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't see you.
In regards to the last project, I was just wondering, when you're looking at kind of integrating more of the smaller groups, such as younger generations and makers, and having more sort of stewardship that really benefits the local human scale. What are your thoughts on sort of perceiving this on a multi-scalar level, and how do you envision these sort of smaller scale approaches fitting within a larger context that a lot of the times we don't see some of the systems that are shaping those smaller scales, but essentially they're still feeding into it and still very important.
Your question is, how does it scale up for larger
Yeah, like
areas?
how do you see working at a smaller scale still fitting within a larger context? And is there an opportunity to work across scales?
Yes, well, I tried to make the point that all scales are necessary. I think what we want is to find the appropriate scale for the given context and situation. It may be, it will be that in some places the larger scale is needed, and what we're trying to do is find the appropriate places for this type of development. I don't think that answers your question, though, does it?
Does anybody else have any thoughts on that? Or just like when you kind of work within a small scale, I guess it's a lot of the times it's more personable, it's more humanly, it's more intimate. But whatever you're designing or you're implementing at that small scale still fits within a larger context, whether that's political or cultural or ecological. There's all of these things from a larger context that are essentially still shaping those small scales. So is there a way to strategize how you, maybe at a bigger scale, can lay out maybe a phasing or hierarchy to tackle those smaller pockets that still work together within a larger harmonious context that ties them together?
Well, there are lots of organizations that are working on these larger scales, and we're trying to avoid overlap with them. If you think about movements dedicated to smart growth, for example, that work at regional scales and city scales, we leave to them that size. And what we try to do is identify people who want to work at neighborhood scales, community scales, and do what we can to help them.
I think this gets to John's hoping to get into this conversation of like the master plan versus the smaller, like local thing too. But just in terms of the art context, the Western Front, through its building purchase and all this stuff, became part of a case study for the city in terms of dealing with these community amenity contributions. And so we were part of the city's master plan, which I think on the one hand is great, but on the other hand, the city also has to allow for smaller, young artists just coming out of art school to find a building and do what they want to do without clamping down on them with policy at the same time. So it's like these things have to operate. Policy needs to exist, these overarching large things exist, but they also have to allow, it's like heterogeneity versus homogeneity. It's a pretty we talk about this all the time in various different contexts, so.
Yeah, so I just think it's incredibly naive to think that we, in the current neoliberal context, operating at scales of a few people at a time is going to solve anything. I lived in San Francisco in the 90s when they codified the loft building type. If any of you are familiar with that type, it basically simulated an artist's loft environment, hyper-dense, taller, no side yard setbacks, less of a setback on the back. And basically it was co-opted by capital. So now what we have are, web designers, basically a whole way of manipulating a set of desires around supporting art, supporting artists in a progressive government culture. It was debased, So, I have a friend on my faculty, Inga Roker, who tried to build a micro development project right next to a West Bank building in Chinatown. And I mean, it was near, the fact that it got built was incredible. It's roughly 30 units, I think, which is not small even. But that's about as small as you can get if you want to work within the current development model of this city. So, and many cities, not just this city. This city happens to be kind of especially, I think among the more rarefied development cultures in North America. So I don't know. I feel like you're asking the wrong question when you assume that these kind of intimacies are coming in the way that you assume they're to come. There can be intimacies at big scales too, and it's a matter of finding methods of communicating and governance feedback loops that might produce that intimacy, not simply thinking that the scale of building or development has to be small.
Yeah, I want to unpack that debate, though, a little bit more. In the spirit of the urbanarium debates, Brian, do you agree with that? I think John is... I want to argue. Yeah, I think John is basically saying, that the scale of the problem is so huge, we need government intervention to create a system that can unroll at the appropriate scale of the problems that confront us. But it seems to me that the lean urbanism thing is basically saying, no, it's organic and ground up and it's very small and small is beautiful kind of thing. So it seems like there's a debate, even though in some ways the similarities in terms of your intentions. You both want to understand that regulation is in the way. So I'd like to hear your response to what John has just said.
I don't necessarily disagree. As I stated, the system is rigged. The system is rigged to produce big projects. It's rigged to benefit.
You sound like a Sanders voter.
It's rigged to produce big projects and to benefit big actors. I would say that the task of changing that system at a really big scale is perhaps naive. And if not naive, at least slow. I would say unlikely, but I'm confident saying it's going to be slow. In the meantime then, what can the people who want to do things, what can they do? How can they be helped? And our focus is to, our approach is to at one time wear a hat that works with the Congress for the New Urbanism, for example, to make changes on a federal or state or regional level, where that is appropriate. But when it's appropriate, to just daylight ways that people have figured out how to do things, and to make that information available to these people so that they can also do it. One other thing that we do is we focus on platforms. A platform that people here may be familiar with is, the Apple iTunes Store is an example. It is a platform that is global, but it allows individuals to develop and sell their own products. Whether it's fair, whether it works, isn't really the point. But what I'm talking about is a concept. A community development corporation is another type of a platform that offers smaller actors the resources to work on their own, perhaps in conjunction, but a way to pool resources.
Okay. Caitlin, yeah, I want to get to some other questions, so Caitlin, you'll get the last word quick.
I guess my question about the master plan is, what happens when the master plan is enacted not by planners and government, but enacted by private construction and development firms? The question came up in the previous panel about why there's no social housing for families being built. Well, for those of you in Vancouver, you know, around the Science World on the North Falls Creek Flats, there's a huge piece of property. The viaducts are coming down, all of that stuff is coming down. Co-op housing for families is not going up there because the city, the federal government, those people are not enacting what we would see as a proper plan. It's West Bank, it's Ani, it's all these companies that. So I think it's not the idea of the master plan, but it's the way in which the master plan gets enacted in this kind of like hyper-capitalist system.
And for what purpose? Okay, Claire, go ahead.
I have a question for our first two speakers, John and Colleen. I see some similarities between your presentation. Both are the projects in developing countries, and both are using a more Western style of design to do the project in India and China. But on the other hand, I heard someone say that this Western style way of planning or design is not going to happen or not going to fit in a political or economic or cultural context in the developing countries. So I'm wondering, what do you think of, is it possible to practice the Western way of planning or design in the developing countries? I'm not thinking about the urban forms, but more of a way to plan or design.
I can go. Thank you for the question. I don't think I have a solid conclusion at this point, since I'm at my preliminary stage of my research. I would say it's a paradox. Western ideas are highly desired in some situations in developing countries, or let's say China, right? People like things to be westernized, and it shows that it's advanced, it's modernized, you know. But to be able to have this kind of ideas adopted in China, which, you know, in a very centralized government, you need some kind of policy support. In the project that I looked at, it is atypical because the local government actually did give the developer more autonomous to figure out what they want to do, as long as they incorporate, for example, touristic development in this case. So I would say this kind of mechanism is not dominant in the context of China, but I do see the potential of happening in other cases based on how the public respond to it. And do you want to
Yeah, number one, I think you're mistaken to say that the Western ideas about design are not involved. Certainly in the example Colleen showed, an urban design firm from Vancouver, the Jurdy Partnership, they designed the 84 Olympics in LA. I mean, they're basically designers of theme parks, and the scheme that I saw seemed quite resident with that. So, you know, what I was showing was a very different modality of highly stripped away, you know, to the point about regulation and codes and wanting to streamline a form of building that actually can not imagine what would happen if we lived in a Jean Prouvé, you know, mansion of 6,000 square feet, but actually dealt with housing. It might look like that, you know, and so I do think there are in China certainly many, you know, many firms in this city do huge amounts of work in China. In India, it's a little different, and I think your point, Colleen, about the difference in the government systems, the kind of centralized government versus India's very messy democracy, is also at play here in interesting ways. So.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it at that, and I'm sorry you've been waiting, but we're going to have to go to lunch now. So I have a few announcements to make about that lunch. You all have a map in your packages that shows a lot of places to eat within a walking distance. There's one that's missing. It's actually my favorite. It's Kerner's Pub in the Graduate Center, which is immediately to the west of us here. But on the way there's Sage Bistro, and there's also a quicker sandwich bar downstairs in the University Center, which is the first building to the west. So the first building to the west has the Sage Bistro in it. That's called the University Center. The second building along that way is the Graduate Center. If you're a speaker, we wanted to give our speakers special opportunity to get together and mingle at this first little time. So I hope everybody won't be insulted to know that only the speakers get to go to room 202 in the LaSalle building, which is the second building immediately to the south, affectionately known to us as the Architecture Building. So we have more or less ended on time, 3 minutes over, not bad. So we will reconvene right around 1:30. So you all have an hour to refresh yourself. Thank you very much, and see you in a little while.